Hi, welcome to Educator.com. This is the lesson on Anatomy and Physiology Intro. So we talk about anatomy and physiology as subjects. They kind of go together. You could take them separately in a school, but I really think they belong together, and here's why. Anatomy is the study of the form, structure, and location of bodily parts. So let's take the pericardium, for instance. Pericardium. Cardia or cardium, derived from that, means heart, always. Peri usually means around, surrounding. So this is actually the sac that surrounds the heart. It's made of connective tissue. In terms of the volume that it contains, a little bit bigger than the heart itself because it's wrapped around it. It's located right here. So those are some anatomical facts about the pericardial sac or the pericardium. But the physiology of it is a bit more about what it's doing. The study of the function of bodily parts and the processes involved with them. How is everything in the body connected? What is that organ doing with respect to the other one? What's the function of these different parts? So with the pericardium, if you consider the fact that inside of that sac, there's a little fluid layer adjacent to the outside of the heart, that fluid is kind of like lubrication for the beating heart and protective. I mean, think about it as like moving engine parts. You need oil in your engine for it to function properly, and the pericardial sac is about lubricating the heart and protecting it. So there's some physiological facts associated with the pericardium. When it comes to the parts of the body and what's in it, you have to know about the building blocks of matter. What are all molecules made of in the body? What are all the tissues made of? Well, it comes down to atoms. All molecules are composed of atoms. Occasionally in this course, you will see subatomic particles like protons and electrons and talking about what those do. But more often, it's atoms and bigger in this particular course. So we talk about the different kinds of atoms on planet Earth. It really comes down to the different elements. So if you remember the periodic table of elements from a chemistry course, every single element, its smallest functional unit is an atom. So let's take the big three in the human body. Oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. So those three, most plentiful atoms in the human body. You're also going to see nitrogen, calcium, sodium, phosphorus, etc., etc. And we could list them all, but yeah, those are the atoms. And of course, if you remember from a chemistry course, the inside of the atom is a nucleus with protons and neutrons, with electrons spinning around the outside. So if we put atoms together, we're going to get molecules. Some common molecules you'd find in the human body: H2O, water; CO2, carbon dioxide, what we exhale; and I'll also include O2. The difference between oxygen up here and oxygen down here is this is the gas that we're actually breathing in and using for aerobic respiration in our cells. As a gas, it's usually two oxygen atoms linked together with a covalent bond. If we take a lot more atoms and put them together, we're going to get what are called macromolecules. And macro means big. We're talking big molecules here. These are also known as typically organic compounds because they're carbon-based and have to do with life. Carbohydrates, also known as sugars. Protein, a very important one. And let's also list DNA. That's another macromolecule, RNA. These are all very big, lots and lots and lots of atoms, and these are the building blocks of life. So when we put carbohydrates, proteins, fats, DNA, stuff like that together in a very functional kind of form, we can get organelles. And organelles are pretty much the organs of microscopic cells, all those working parts that allow a cell to stay alive. Most people have heard of the nucleus, the brain of the cell, kind of the control center where DNA is stored and genetic material is expressed. The ribosome. Ribosome is made up of mostly protein and pieces of RNA, which is similar to DNA. But the ribosome is the protein factory of the cell. And let's also list mitochondria. Or let's say chondrion, because that's singular. Chondria would be plural. But this is the powerhouse of the cell, responsible for making energy for the cell to function. So when a bunch of organelles are arranged properly, you get cells. And cells, I mean, that's the basis of a biology class, and of course, anatomy physiology is a branch of that. So we got to talk about cells. You can have red blood cells, RBCs. You actually make at least 1 million per second and lose about 1 million per second. That's amazing, the cycling of red blood cells inside the body. Also, neurons. Neurons are the building blocks of the nervous system. Your brain's made of neurons, spinal cord, nerves made of neurons. And let's go with macrophages. Macrophages are cells that hang out in your tissues, we'll get to that in a sec, and those swallow up foreign invaders. They wrap their plasma membranes around and swallow up bacteria, viruses, stuff that doesn't belong in your body, and destroy it. When you put a bunch of cells together, and they're organized in the correct fashion, and they have a purpose together, we can call that a tissue. One example of tissue in the human body, your epidermis. The outer layers, the outer few layers of your skin, your integumentary system. Mostly dead cells. You lose them constantly. I'm actually losing thousands and thousands by doing this. But I'll make some more, don't worry. Other than that, let's say cerebral cortex. That's another example of a tissue. Cerebral cortex. That's the outermost superficial layer of the brain. You got a lot of action going on in this few millimeters thick layer on the outside of your brain. Very well developed in humans compared to other animals. So that's the cerebral cortex. And how about mucosa? Mucosa. That sounds like mucus, right? No coincidence. So mucosa, when we talk about the insides of organs that are secreting something, letting go of some kind of fluid, something that helps digest things, for instance, that layer that has a bunch of glands doing that business is called the mucosa. So the innermost lining of the stomach, mucosa. Organs. Hey, speaking of stomach, that's made of a bunch of tissues that help your digestive system. So yeah, the stomach, definitely an organ. The heart. It's a well-known organ, and I'm going to name one that's not as well-known. The thymus. Yeah, the thymus is an organ that helps with your immune system. It's actually located just behind the breastbone or the sternum, very close to your heart. So that's the thymus. And organ systems. Respiratory. So all of those organs together associated with getting air in and out of your body, getting oxygen into your bloodstream, getting CO2 out so you can exhale it. The endocrine system, which has to do with hormones. Not just sex hormones. Hormones usually are helping to regulate all kinds of organs in your body and what they're doing and how much of it they're doing. And how about cardiovascular? Running out of room there, but yeah, the cardiovascular, the heart, blood vessels, how you're pumping blood around your body. And organisms. You and me. We are organisms, of course, made of cooperating organ systems, and down the line, all of this stuff's in us, and it's very important, all of it together. So the relative positions, those are very important when we're talking about anatomy and physiology. So instead of saying like, oh yeah, that thing is to the left of that other thing, or that thing's above it, you can be very specific about how items are related to each other, how tissues are related to each other inside the body. So that if I do a handstand and all of a sudden now my heart is below my stomach, even though my body's upside down, we can still use the same relative position based on where the heart is related to my stomach in my body, regardless of how my body's oriented. So the first one we'll talk about is anterior versus posterior, and we could also say ventral versus dorsal. It's the same thing in a human body. These are all relative terms, meaning I can't just say this statement, the heart is anterior. Anterior to what? Or if I said, the brain is posterior. Well, posterior to what? So it's all relative, relating one part of the body to another. So anterior always means towards the front, like the front of my body, posterior towards the back. And ventral versus dorsal, same thing in a human body. So ventral, that's the front side. Dorsal, like a dorsal fin on a fish, towards the back side. Let me draw some quick human bodies for you. just for the sake of labeling some of this stuff. Big torso on this guy. All right, so anterior versus posterior. So when we're talking anterior, definitely towards that side, and posterior towards the back end. For instance, we could say the heart, which is behind my breastbone, is posterior to the sternum or breastbone, which I'm tapping here, because the heart is more towards the back than that particular bone. We could then flip those two subjects, those two organs or parts, and use the term anterior. I could say, hey, the sternum or breastbone is anterior to the heart because it's more towards the front. Now remember I mentioned that in the human body, this is the same. The reason why I specified that is because take a dog, for instance. A dog, his or her head is pointed a little bit differently than ours with respect to the spine. So if I drew a dog body here, you would see that anterior on a dog is actually more towards the face, not necessarily more towards the chest region, because the dog's chest, when it's standing up, would be oriented towards the ground, and the head would be, that way or that way. So you can see how dorsal on a dog is different than posterior. Dorsal on a dog would mean towards his or her back side, where a dorsal fin would be, and posterior would be towards the buttocks region or the tail. But because of our posture, it's the same in the human body. So you can use these interchangeably. Anterior is to ventral, as posterior is to dorsal. Same thing. All right. Superior versus inferior. This is about what's above or below. Let's use green. Okay, superior versus inferior. So superior, more towards the head. Inferior, more towards the bottom of the body. Here's an example. Earlier I mentioned heart and stomach. So the heart, right about here, the stomach, just down here. We could say that the heart is superior to the stomach. Flip the terms, you could say the stomach is inferior to the heart. And like I mentioned earlier, if I do a handstand, it's the same thing. Another example, let's say the eyes are superior to the mouth. The mouth is inferior to the eyes. Medial versus lateral. Medial, as the name states, kind of means like median, towards the middle, medial along the midline. So if it's closer to the middle of the body, you're going to call that medial relative to whatever is lateral to it. Lateral meaning towards the sides, either side. So let's take the spleen. Okay, so the spleen is tucked under right here on your left side next to the stomach, and the liver is actually much more in the center. So is the stomach. We could say that the stomach is medial to the spleen, which is more towards the side. The spleen is lateral to the stomach. So more out towards this way is lateral, and more towards this way is medial. Med. That's what that says, med. Proximal and distal. Let's use black. These terms always have to do with the limbs. Arms and legs, always. And it's a better term than using, let's say, superior and inferior. For instance, when we're talking about the arm, I could say that my finger bones, also called phalanges, are distal to my humerus, which is the upper arm bone here. Distal means farther away from the trunk of the body. Regardless of where I put my arms, that's the truth. My fingers here are the farthest away from the trunk compared to everything else on the arms or the legs. Proximal is the opposite. I could say that my humerus is proximal to my phalanges, my finger bones. So that's how those work. We could say it with the legs too. We could say the kneecap or patella is distal to the femur, which is the thigh bone, actually the biggest bone in the body. So let's do it here on the leg. Distal, farther towards the bottom, or away from the trunk, and prox. Yep, with the arms and the legs. And finally, superficial and deep. I'll go back and use red again. So, superficial, more towards the surface. The epidermis around the outside of your body is the most superficial structure. Deep means below, farther inside the body. So I mentioned the word mucosa in a previous slide. Mucosa is the innermost set of tissues in the stomach. So you could say that the mucosa is deep to the serosa, which is actually the outer layer of the stomach. When we go back to skin, we could say that the dermis, which is below the epidermis, is deep to the epidermis, and vice versa. The epidermis on the outside is superficial to the dermis. So I'm just going to highlight a superficial part in yellow. See, the outside of this person's body is superficial. Just a reminder there of what that specifically means. And those are the relative positions. They're going to come up a lot when we talk about organs and tissues in future lessons. Body planes, very important in terms of the study of the human body, taking views or nice pictures of the insides of organs and how tissues are related to each other. So if we took, let's say, the heart, and the heart oriented just like this in my body, if we took it out and then cut it like this so that you could see through the most anterior from the previous slide or ventral layers and inside the heart, that would be a coronal or frontal cut. So you could see that in blue here, this plane that's going right through this person, right through the middle of their body, that's a coronal or frontal cross-section or plane. So if we took the heart and cut right through it this way, that's a frontal section. We could do the same thing with the face specifically. There are interesting images of the part of the skull where the nasal bones or the deep ones at least are just back there, and you can see all the twists and turns of your nasal conchae. And you'll see sometimes these visions of that part of the skull, and it's a frontal cut. Sagittal. Let's do that in red. So sagittal is actually this particular direction. So if this is the x-axis, you could call this a y-axis. So a mid-sagittal cross-section means straight through the middle. But this is also a sagittal one. This is a sagittal one. This is a sagittal one. As long as it's oriented this way in terms of how the organ is cut. So let's take the heart again. A sagittal cross-section would separate the left and right sides of the heart. So that's sagittal. And finally, the third dimension, transverse, also called horizontal planes or sections. That's anything that's like this. So a good view inside the abdominal cavity in terms of how the organs are positioned relative to each other. What's deep, what's lateral compared to other structures. That's how you would do that. You would take a transverse or horizontal section straight through the abdomen like this. If we did it with the heart, you'd be able to look down inside of the ventricles, the lower chambers or inferior chambers, and the atria, which are superior to that. So these body planes, very important for cutting through organs or getting a good view of the insides of your body. And finally, these are abdominopelvic regions. This is applying some of the terms we've already gone over in this lesson to specific terminology with the parts of the body. They usually come from Latin terms, like the word inguinal having to do with the groin, or the term gastric having to do with the stomach. So we'll label some of these regions, and there's a few ways you could split up this part of the body in terms of talking about the regions. So the two main ways, we're going to start with 4 quadrants. So we could take this whole section here, and split it up right next to where the navel is. That's right on top of the navel, really. That's the cross-section of these 4 quadrants. And since they're called quadrants, we know they'd have to be 4. So when we're looking at this person's body, the right and left side is relative to him or her, not relative to the viewer. So if you're looking at my heart, on your right is actually the left side of my heart, the left atrium and left ventricle, and vice versa. So with this particular guy, even though this is on your left, this is called the right upper quadrant. RUQ, right upper quadrant. So of course, next to it over here would be the left upper quadrant. Makes sense. You can probably guess what's inferior to that or below it. The right lower quadrant. And of course the left lower quadrant. The right lower quadrant, or lower right quadrant, comes up in emergency rooms now and then because of an appendicitis. If you ever experience a really sharp pain in your right lower quadrant or lower right quadrant, go to the ER. We're talking sharp, unbearable pain just down here, below the stomach, below your small intestine. The appendix is actually a little worm-like looking pouch coming off the beginning of your large intestine. And if that gets infected and is not removed through an appendicitis, it could kill a person. So it's better to be safe than sorry. If you have an appendicitis-like pain, get yourself to the ER. And that would be just down here in the right lower quadrant. Then when we move on to this particular one here, we can divvy it up into 9 regions. Let's use blue for that. Looks like tic-tac-toe. Those are the 9 regions. So let's start with the superior parts. Right here, remember, it's the right side, even though to us looking at it, it's the left. This is the right hypochondriac region. What? Hypochondriac? Doesn't that mean somebody who thinks they're getting sick all the time? Yes, that is one translation of the word, but hypochondriac also in Latin could mean below bone or under bone. And look, in this part of the abdominopelvic region, you do have the lower or inferior parts of your rib cage or thoracic cage right here. So the organs hidden under here, some of it's the liver, gallbladder, a portion of this kidney here, under the right hypochondriac region. So on the other side, left hypochondriac region. And you can see that the liver, not much of it's located over here, but you do have a portion of the stomach, a little bit of the pancreas, and a part of the left kidney. Central right here, or medial to those regions, you would say that this is the epigastric region, which pretty much means over the stomach, or above the stomach. So that's the epigastric region. When we look at this part here, you can see the L3, L4, L5, and L2 is covered by that line. Same thing over here. These regions, you can call the lumbar regions because they are located right next to the lumbar portion of the spine. L3 is lumbar 3. It's the 3rd lumbar vertebra, and the same with these. We'll talk about those in a future lesson. So this is the right lumbar, and this is the left lumbar. Here, you can call this the umbilical region because of that navel, your belly button. And finally, we got 3 left. This one down here, you can call the hypogastric or pubic region. It's below or really inferior to where the stomach is and most of your digestive organs. Hypogastric can mean that, or we can also call it the pubic region. And it's obvious why that is. Here and here, there's a couple names as well. You can call this the right inguinal region and left inguinal region, which means right and left of the groin area. If you've ever heard of an inguinal hernia, that's the area that would be located in. Hernias will come up in a future lesson. And the other one we could also say is the iliac region, and I'll explain why in a sec. So this is left iliac, right iliac, because the hip bones or your pelvis bones, each one of them, it's actually 2 that fit together, are actually known as ilia. One of them is an ilium, the other one is the left ilium, right ilium, left ilium. And then the crest, or kind of the peak of that hip bone that we feel below our waistline, I'm touching them right now, they'd be right here and right here. So they actually are the lower parts of them, and part of the crest is actually found in this area. It's called the iliac crest, that little part. So the lower parts, the whole thing that makes up the majority of your pelvis, they're known as ilia. So that's why you could also use these terms, the iliac regions. Thanks for watching Educator.com.